The stories our grandparents tell are fantastic. They have a perfect mix of terror and fantasy that allows us to imagine a time when stories were passed down by word of mouth, with each person adding their own personal touch. When I started this series, I still had both of my grandmothers with me. Now that they are no longer here, I like to remember them through the stories they once told me. If you still have the fortune of having your grandparents with you, talk to them. Ask them to share their anecdotes and experiences so that they are not lost over time. That way you can pass them on to the world. So get comfortable and turn off the lights, because these are just some of the horror stories our grandparents have told us, shared by the people in our audience. How are you? Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Greetings, friends, and welcome to the creepy world. We begin. The mysterious visitor. When my grandmother was young, she lived with one of her sisters and her brother-in-law. One morning, someone knocked on their door so loudly that everyone in the house woke up. Who could that be, they wondered. According to my grandmother, a man outside was begging for help. He said he was badly hurt, bleeding, and about to die. My grandmother's sister was about to open the door, but my grandmother stopped her. The voice outside kept insisting, growing more desperate. The longer they refused to help, the more the tension increased. The voice, once weak and pleading, became aggressive and loud. He no longer seemed to be asking for help. He was demanding to be let in. My grandmother remembers hearing screams, cries, and whimpers as that thing outside tried to get into the house. Then suddenly, everything went silent. A few seconds later, my grandmother and the others cautiously looked out the window. There was nothing outside. The dancing woman. A few months ago, my grandmother attended a rosary at a friend's house. It was already getting dark when she decided to go to the bathroom. As she reached the end of the hallway, she saw a young woman, about 20 years old, standing there. The woman was smiling at her, staring. She wore a long, wide skirt. My grandmother said her smile was unsettling, unnatural, too exaggerated. Her eyes remained fixed on her, and at the same time, she moved her skirt rapidly from side to side, as if trying to dance in a strange, unnatural way. In that moment, my grandmother realized that the girl was not human. Terrified, she turned around and ran back to her friends. When she told them what had happened, the owner of the house responded in an eerily calm manner. "Oh, that was my daughter. Like she died years ago. I'm sorry you saw her." Beyond that, she said nothing more. My grandmother never returned to that house. The Cursed Ranch. My grandparents always told me that on the ranch where they lived, dogs would go crazy after spending some time there. My grandmother once had a large dog, and just like the others before him, he suddenly became aggressive for no apparent reason. The man on the black horse. When my grandfather was a young man, he would often return home after tending to his crops. One evening around 5 p.m., he was on his way back. In my father's town, there is a belief that the devil roams after 6 in the evening. My grandfather was very superstitious, but he never said that he was starting to experience something strange. That day, as he walked along the path, he heard footsteps behind him. Thinking it was a neighbor or an animal, he slowed down, expecting whoever was behind him to pass. But when he turned around, there was nothing there. A strange heat filled the air, not the usual summer warmth, but a suffocating, unbearable heat that made it difficult to breathe. He started walking faster, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly, and the sky darkened quickly. Feeling dizzy, my grandfather decided to sit down for a moment. As he looked at the ground, he noticed the legs of a horse standing before him. For some reason, he felt an overwhelming fear. He didn't want to look up. Then he heard a hoarse, deep voice. "Hello. Do you need help?" My grandfather remained silent. The voice asked again, "Do you need help?" His heart pounded in his chest. The man, now impatient, asked once more, but this time his voice sounded distorted, unnatural. "Do you want my help?" My grandfather gathered all his strength and firmly replied, "No." The man let out a chilling laugh and slowly walked away. When he was far enough, my grandfather finally dared to look up. He froze in terror. The man was riding a gigantic jet black horse, but instead of human legs, the creature had the feet of a crow. Its rider grinned at my grandfather, revealing a mouth full of sharp fangs. With a sinister smile, the man raised a hand in farewell and vanished into the darkness. Solomon was my grandfather's name. After that strange encounter, my grandfather woke up in his house surrounded by healers and witches. Confused, he asked my grandmother what had happened. She told him that they had found him lying unconscious at the entrance of the town and that he had been delirious with fever for 3 days. I don't know if this can be considered a horror story, but my grandfather told me that when he was no older than 15, he used to travel with his father. At that time, trips were generally made on horseback, sometimes taking several days to reach their destination. Back then, there were inns, similar to modern-day roadside hotels, where travelers could rest. On one of their many trips, my grandfather and his father were delayed, and night inevitably caught up with them. Fortunately, or unfortunately, there was an inn nearby. My grandfather recalled that upon arriving, he noticed a strange smell, but after the long journey, both he and my great-grandfather decided to ignore it. As soon as they entered, my grandfather fell asleep. However, in the early morning, his father abruptly woke him up. Strange noises filled the air. Alarmed, they both got up and rushed outside to check on their horses. The owner of the inn saw them and invited them to have a plate of fritada, a traditional dish from my country. They accepted the food, but as my grandfather stirred his plate, he nearly fainted. Inside the stew, he had found a human finger. Terrified, both of them fled from the inn and never returned. My grandfather said that gruesome image remains engraved in his memory to this day. The Witch on the Roof. This story was told to us by my maternal grandmother. At the time, she had recently married my grandfather, and they still lived on the ranch. Shortly after, my grandmother became pregnant, and that was when she began to feel a deep fear at night. She said that as she walked through the house, she could clearly hear something moving on the roof, following her wherever she went. She told my grandfather about it, and every time she did, he would rush out to the patio with his rifle, only to see a large owl flying away from the roof. This continued throughout her pregnancy. When my uncle was born, the harassment became even worse. My grandmother claimed that the witch, as she called it, would come to the window in the early hours of the morning and sing in a terrifying way. My grandfather would run outside, cursing at the creature, and the owl would fly away. But as it did, it let out a macabre, almost human laugh. Tired of living in fear, my grandparents decided to move to my grandmother's parents' house. But to their horror, the thing followed them. A few days later, they took my uncle to the hospital. The Hungry Dead. When I visited my grandfather's house in a small town in southern Puebla, Mexico, I heard many stories. One of them was about something that happened on nights when there was no moon. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, the chickens that slept in the trees would suddenly wake up, cackling and screaming in terror. My grandfather said it was the dead who frightened them. During the Mexican Revolution, many people were buried throughout the town. According to legend, the dead would rise at night, scaring the chickens so they would fall from the trees, allowing the spirits to feast on them. I always thought it was just stray dogs or cats. But the strange thing was that the next morning, the chickens were found without any visible wounds. In other cases, there were bloodstains on the ground as if the birds had exploded. Sometimes, chickens were found in terrible condition, their bodies mangled beyond explanation. The Man Who Played in Hell. My grandmother told me about a strange case that happened in her ejido, a communal farming village. There was a man named Don Juan who played the tololoche, a traditional string instrument, at the town fair. As the event came to an end, everyone began heading home. But before Don Juan left the stage, a mysterious man approached him. The stranger didn't seem to be from the area. Unlike the other ranchers, whom everyone knew, this man was a complete stranger. He wore an immaculate charro suit and the finest black hat that money could buy. The man invited Don Juan to play at his ranch, offering him a large sum of money. Though today, 3 small bags of coins may not seem like much, back then they were gold and a fortune. Don Juan hesitated, saying he would prefer to bring his entire band, but the charro insisted that only the tololoche was needed. At around 2 a.m., Don Juan mounted a jet-black horse beside the man. "Close your eyes. Do not open them until I tell you," the charro ordered. Don Juan felt uneasy, but when the man tripled the payment offer, he reluctantly agreed. As the horse took off, Don Juan could feel himself rising. Unable to resist his curiosity, he cracked his eyes open, only to see that they were flying through the night sky. Terrified, he clung to his tololoche until they landed atop a distant hill. There, a crack opened in the rocky terrain, revealing a lavish underground party. Despite the lack of music, the guests were lively, eagerly awaiting his performance. Don Juan was escorted to an extravagant stage, better than the one at the fair, and played for over 6 hours. He played every song he knew and even improvised. After a while, he was given a break. As he drank a fine whiskey at the bar, a woman approached him. "Are you Don Juan, the husband of so-and-so?" she asked. When he confirmed it, she handed him an envelope filled with money and a letter, requesting that he deliver it to her family. One by one, more people approached him, giving him letters, bags of money, and other sealed items, each asking him to deliver them to their loved ones. It was then that Don Juan realized something horrifying. He knew these people, but they had all died long ago. Despite his terror, he had no choice but to keep playing. Eventually, it was time to leave. Following the same instructions, he mounted the black horse, closed his eyes, and was taken back to where he had started. The charro paid him exactly as promised. But when Don Juan returned to town, something was wrong. His neighbors found him wandering near the road and took him home. His wife was furious. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "I was playing at a party all night on the hill," Don Juan swore. "All night?" His wife scoffed. "You've been missing for 6 months, Juan. Don't take me for a fool. You must have another woman and another family outside San Luis." Don Juan turned pale. 6 months? That was impossible. In a panic, he pulled out the money and letters he had received at the party. "I swear, look. They gave me all this." But it wasn't a normal party. It was full of the dead. His wife was about to scold him again, but then neighbors began arriving. Each person found a letter or a gift from their deceased loved ones. From that moment on, Don Juan was never the same. He fell ill with an incurable fear. To this day, my grandmother and her family in San Luis swear that every word of this story is true. What do you think of these stories? Tell me what horror stories your grandparents have shared with you. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. As always, a big thank you to all of you. If you haven't subscribed to Scary Night Fear Zone, you can do so now by clicking the button on the screen. Without further ado, I say goodbye.